Alright, thank God it's fantasy football season. I'm Buster Brown, and the show is Redemption Rehab. If you tuned in today, it's for one reason. It's to start winning championships in fantasy football. Today, we're talking about my top picks on the weekly waiver wire that'll help you get the job done. So let's head over to the weekly waiver wire report
and check out the facts.
All right, yeah, it's week 14 of the NFL season. In most leagues, it's playoff time. Hopefully, you're doing well and have made the playoffs in your league with our help. We're going to help you take it to the next level and win a championship for 2019. Today, we're on our website and we're going to give you the players to help you get the job done. So buckle up, get out your popcorn, and let's head over to the chalkboard
and check out the facts.
Okay, here we are back talking running backs and making a run in the playoffs to win a championship. If you already have a starting running back on your team, you should have his handcuff, which is the backup on the same team. For example, let's take Minnesota Vikings Dalvin Cook. His handcuff or backup is Mackenzie Alexander. Another example would be like if you had Todd Gurley, you should have Malcolm Brown on your team because he's the handcuff to Todd Gurley. Don't go into the playoffs without your starting running back's handcuffs because you could find yourself on the losing end of a game. Let's take a look at some of the running backs we mentioned last week that had a good week and you should have picked them up. Starting with the Indianapolis Colts, Nyheim Hines. He had 4 rushes for 22 yards and a TD, and he also added 2 receptions for 18 yards on 2 targets. Or how about the Seattle Seahawks, Rashard Penny, who was 15 of 74 with 1 TD. He also had 4 receptions for 33 yards and another TD on 4 targets. And we also mentioned the Pittsburgh Steelers' Benny Snell Jr., who rushed 16 times for 63 yards and 1 TD with 1 catch for 4 yards on 1 target. We mentioned these guys last week and they all had good weeks. You should have picked them up, but it's never too late. And let's not forget about Bo Scarborough of the Detroit Lions. He also had a decent week, rushing 20 times for about 80 plus yards. If you didn't get any of those guys, let me give you some other running backs that maybe are on your waiver wire. Starting with the Washington Redskins, Darius Geis, who rushed 10 times for 29 yards and had 2 TDs, along with 2 receptions for 8 yards on 3 targets. A lot of people picked him up a couple weeks ago, but cut him because he didn't do anything. But you know what? They should have held on to him another week. So check your waiver wire and see if he's on there and stash him on your bench. Let me give you another running back you should keep your eye on and see if he's on your waiver wire for week 14 of the NFL season, and that's the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Peyton Barber, who rushed 17 times for 44 yards, and he had 2 TDs with no receptions. It's clear that he's the goal line back going forward, and if Peyton Barber's on your waiver wire, you should stash him on your bench going forward. Let me give you another running back you should keep your eye on this week and see if he's on your waiver wire, and that's the San Francisco 49ers, Raheem Mostert, who rushed 19 times for a whopping 146 yards and a TD with 2 receptions for 8 yards. They got a lot of people in the backfield in San Francisco. Matt Breida's banged up. We're not sure about everybody else, so if you got an extra roster spot, you might want to stick Mostert on your bench in case he gets another start or has another good game like he did in week 13. And let me give you one more sleeper to add to your bench, and that's the Kansas City Chiefs' Darwin Thompson, who rushed 11 times for 44 yards and 1 TD with no receptions. It's also important to keep an eye on the Indianapolis Colts backfield because we've been mentioning Jordan Wilkins for a while now, and he rushed last week for 11 times for 47 yards with 2 catches for 9 yards on 3 targets. We've told you in the past we think that's the handcuff to Marlon Mack, and he's going to be out for a while. So if you get a chance, go pick up Jordan Wilkins and maybe stash him on your bench and see if he doesn't help you win a championship in 2019. Let's go take a look at some wide receivers that we mentioned last week that you should have picked up because they had a hell of a week. Starting with the Atlanta Falcons' Russell Gage, who caught 5 passes for 52 yards with 1 TD on 5 targets without Julio Jones on Thanksgiving. Hey, if Julio Jones is hurt, man, you got to go out and get Russell Gage. That's the guy that seems to be picking up the slack for Julio Jones and Sanu not being on the same team anymore. So if you get a chance, go out and nab him. Let me give you another wide receiver you should keep an eye on this week, and that's the Pittsburgh Steelers' James Washington, who was 4 receptions for 111 yards and 1 TD on 4 targets. He had a big game. You should have picked him up. We tried to tell you last week, and he went out and scored almost 20 points. We also told you about these guys. How about the Chicago Bears' Anthony Miller, who caught 9 passes for a whopping 140 yards on 13 targets. We told you a couple weeks ago and last week to get him. If you did, you benefited. If he's still on your waiver wire, go pick him up. He's going to help you win a championship. And let me give you another name to remember, and that's the San Francisco 49ers' Deebo Samuels, who had 2 receptions for 41 yards with 1 TD on 4 targets. He also rushed 1 time for 20 yards. We've been mentioning Deebo Samuels for the last 3-4 weeks. I picked him up. You should have picked him up too because he scores every week. So get out there and get him. If we mentioned these guys last week, if you had picked them up, you did a good job. But if you didn't, and they're not on your waiver wire, we've got some help for you for week 14. Some wide receivers you want to keep an eye on this week who had big games last week are wide receivers like the Buffalo Bills wide receiver Cole Beasley, who had 6 receptions for 110 yards and 1 TD on 7 targets in a revenge game against his former team, the Dallas Cowboys. Whenever a player goes back to play for a team that didn't want him or maybe let him go or didn't sign him to the big contract, he always wants revenge, and that's what happened with Cole Beasley last week. Might not do it again the rest of the year, but he's worth picking up and stashing on your bench. Let me give you a couple more wide receivers you should be looking at for week 14. Starting with the Indianapolis Colts' Zach Pascal, who caught 7 passes for 109 yards on 10 targets. With injuries to T.Y. Hilton and Eric Ebron, and the fact that the running back core isn't very good, players like Zach Pascal are picking up the slack. He might be worth adding to your bench, especially if T.Y. Hilton is out in week 14. Let me give you some sleepers that'll help you in week 14, starting with the Atlanta Falcons' Christian Blake, who had 6 receptions for 57 yards on 9 targets. With the injury to Julio Jones, he might get some playing time. Or how about the Green Bay Packers' Allen Lazard, who had 3 receptions for 103 yards and 1 TD on 3 targets. And we can't forget about the Tampa Bay Buccaneers' Brashard Perryman, who had 5 catches for 87 yards on 7 targets. Look, these are sleepers. They might not have numbers like this the rest of the year, but they might be worth adding to your bench. Let's head over and take a look at some of the tight ends that we mentioned last week, because they also had a very good week. Starting with the Indianapolis Colts' Jack Doyle, who caught 6 passes for 73 yards and 1 TD on 11 targets. Or how about the New York Giants' Caden Smith, who caught 6 passes for 70 yards on 8 targets. Or how about the Miami Dolphins' Mike Gesicki, who caught 5 passes for 79 yards and 1 TD on 7 targets. Or how about the Philadelphia Eagles' Dallas Goedert, who caught 6 passes for 66 yards on 7 targets. We mentioned all these guys last week and weeks prior to this, and they're starting to come into their own. If your tight end didn't do very good and you're tired of getting low points, you might want to consider picking one of these guys up, because we've been mentioning them all year. Let me give you a couple other tight ends we've mentioned in previous weeks, like Kyle Rudolph and Jacob Hollister. Kyle Rudolph had 4 catches for 50 yards and a TD on 6 targets in Week 13, and Jacob Hollister of the Seattle Seahawks had 6 catches for 44 yards on 8 targets. Once Adam Thielen comes back, I doubt you'll see Kyle Rudolph scoring touchdowns, but we don't know when that's going to happen. Jacob Hollister seems to be picking up slack for a poor wide receiver effort in Seattle. So you might want to consider picking these guys up if they're still available on your waiver wire. But if these guys that we've mentioned last week and the week prior aren't available, let me give you a guy that probably is available and he's doing well. And that's the Los Angeles Rams' Tyler Higbee, who had 7 catches for 107 yards and 1 TD on 8 targets. If the injury to Gerald Everett continues to linger, this is the guy that's going to pick up the slack. If Gerald Everett comes back, then they're going to split time at tight end, and he's not as valuable. Keep an eye on that injury situation. And let me give you 2 people we mentioned prior to your draft that have not played well all year. It's managed to find some targets in Week 13, and that's Tampa Bay Buccaneers' O.J. Howard, who had 5 receptions for 61 yards on 6 targets. Or how about the Cincinnati Bengals' C.J. Uzomah, who had 5 receptions for 51 yards on 6 targets. We were kind of high on these guys prior to the draft, but for some reason, they fell out of favor with their team. But they might be able to help you in Week 14. Consider stashing them on your bench, but don't expect a lot. Let's go take a look at some quarterbacks we mentioned last week that you should have picked up. Starting with the Miami Dolphins' Ryan Fitzpatrick, who was 27 of 39 for 365 yards and 3 TDs. He also rushed 3 times for 2 yards. We told you to pick this guy up, and he had a big day. You should have stashed him on your bench. He's probably gone. But if you didn't get him, let me give you another quarterback we told you about last week, and that's the Carolina Panthers' Kyle Allen. He was 27 of 46 for 278 yards and 2 touchdowns. He also rushed 4 times for 22 yards and another TD. Both these quarterbacks have good matchups throughout the playoffs. If you want, you can start them. Hopefully they play well. I would pick them up and stash them on my bench if you have a great quarterback. These guys were worth having, and we've mentioned them for weeks. Let me give you some defenses that might help you in Week 14 or throughout your playoff run for a championship. Starting with the Green Bay Packers versus the Washington Redskins, or how about the Houston Texans versus the Denver Broncos? Both of these defenses are coming into their own, they're getting healthy, and they have great matchups this week. If you need some kicker advice, I would suggest you do this for the playoffs. Check the waiver wire for any kicker that's kicking indoors or in good weather that has projected high point totals for Week 14. Look, there's got to be some kickers out there in your league. Not everybody in your league makes the playoffs, and I'm sure there's some kickers sitting there that you can get. So don't rely on a kicker playing in bad weather or low point totals. Okay, that's it for the waiver wire report for Week 14. Good luck in your playoff run. It's all about winning a championship. Hopefully these players that we gave you today will help you get the job done. I'm Buster Brown, the show's Redemption Rehab. Good luck.